Parental discretion is advised.
Hi, welcome to the Liam Scheff Show on UCY TV and Truth Frequency Radio. I was a guest on Vibin with Trevor Eugene last week. I like the interview so much, I'm going to run 25 minutes of it, and then I'll come back for a live second half. Here goes the interview.
That I wanted to get into for sure. You had talked about myth versus history or myth versus reality. Can we get into that a little bit?
Well, how do you know if something is true? Let me ask you, Trevor. How do you know if something is true?
That's a simple question that I think begs a difficult answer. How do I know if something is true? I guess maybe if I can feel it and see it, or I know it to be true, being that I witnessed it. I mean, I don't know. That is kind of a tough question.
So you can see it with your eyes.
Yeah.
You can hold it in your hand. Essentially, it's real to you. All right. How do you know? Why does anybody care about Star Wars? Is Star Wars real? Here's a better question. Is Star Wars real?
No, not at least in the sense that it has happened in the past or in the future or simultaneously now, at least to my knowledge.
All right. So Star Wars isn't a documentary, but the new Star Wars made more money than any movie ever.
Yeah.
It did. So is it real? You know, it's real in a way, but is Star Wars real? Is Han Solo a real person? Now, a lot of guys my age and younger would say yes. No. They'd say yes, we want him to be real. He's a real character. But what does that mean? He's a real character. A myth is a story that is psychologically and emotionally compelling. In fact, a myth is a story that's so psychologically and emotionally compelling that we do not give a damn if it's actually true, because it is psychologically and emotionally important to us. So Star Wars is psychologically and emotionally important to us. Muhammad, Allah as an idea, Muhammad as an idea, as descriptions are psychologically and emotionally important to many people. Jesus is psychologically and emotionally important to many people. Many people who have never read the Bible will claim that they have a personal relationship with Jesus, which is confusing because he's clearly not a real person in their world. It's something they invoke psychologically and emotionally. What's the difference between a myth and reality? A myth doesn't have to be true, but feels emotionally important and psychologically important. It feels psychologically compelling. So, is the 9/11 official story true? It's emotionally important to many people that the 9/11 story be considered true. But that's not the same question, is it? I didn't say, is it important that people consider the 9/11 story true? The answer would be yes. Because if they don't consider it true, they'll feel that their idea of America is destroyed. So the official story of 9/11 is considered true by many people because psychologically it is required for them not to be disturbed.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, that's like some kind of internal defense mechanism to avoid having to have that, dark night of the soul, right? Where you have to face these things right? I mean, is that something internally that they're doing subconsciously? Because I've experienced it myself where I'm putting things in people's faces that it cannot be denied, and they will come up with anything to, like I said, protect their paradigm.
Right, to protect their paradigm. But is a paradigm true? A paradigm is itself an extended thought or construction about how things might work. It's essentially an intellectual word for a belief system. But let's ask the question, is Jesus true? I mean, is Jesus true? Now ask any good Christian. Yes, Jesus is true. I talk to him every day. Where do you talk to him? In my head. Oh, well, we have a problem now. I don't want to diminish the importance of people having a space to have conversations internally. Mm-hmm. But if you call a voice in your head Jesus, you've given it a personality and an identity that you really got from somewhere else. I mean, this very important process of having an internal dialogue with the self, the greater self, even the Jungian version of the self, which is actually an extended self, an extended group self. Mm-hmm. And then you put one name on it that comes from a translation of Greek from, Aramaic, from Hebraic, from a figure that you haven't even asked yourself if this figure even existed historically. You're just saying you're talking to him. Now, when you say you're talking to a him in your head, you don't really know if it's you who, these are just different parts of human consciousness doing the talking.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, you can probably get into some pretty sticky territory with somebody who is trying to put a personality or think that this internal dialogue, one of the many voices they might be hearing in their head, is actually some God being telling them something.
Well, now let's look at the Western problem of the idea of God. In the East, in the Eastern philosophies anyway, the idea is that God is everything. Mm. I don't mean that God made everything. I mean that God is everything. That the Tao, or the infinite unknowable mind, manifested as all tangible physical what we call creation or material, including sentient beings, including our consciousness, in order to have the experience of finity, of being finite. Sorry if I just made up a word.
No.
Affinity, of being finite. Because the infinite, this is the Eastern spiritual view, that the infinite precipitates or extends itself or manifests itself into an area of being finite. In other words, of having boundaries, top, bottom, inside, outside, hot, cold, male, female, all that kind of stuff, yin and yang. So that the yin and the yang are manifestations of an infinite source. And you cannot touch infinity, you cannot measure infinity. Infinity has no boundaries, therefore it cannot be touched. So we cannot actually comprehend of it, which is what all religions mean when they say the name you use for God is not the name of God. Even the Hebraic religion touches on that. All religions end up saying that. They all say it, and then they immediately forget it, and they call their God Yahweh or Allah or whatever, and they make a lot of rules that they say came from the God. The God didn't make the rules. Human beings made the rules. Now, Jesus is a problem because Jesus is a physically manifested son of a virgin who never parted her hymen somehow, and then was a god, but not a very good god, because he let the Romans kill him, and he could do all kinds of magic, but he couldn't fix the holes in his hands, and he could make as much food out of food, but why didn't he just bring an airplane down to take them somewhere? Why didn't he invent a time machine to go to a better time? He's not really an infinite god. He's kind of, in some of the stories, he can't do magic tricks unless people believe in him. What kind of god is that? And then the next writer said that was obviously not a great story, so they changed him to not wanting to do tricks unless people believed in him. The stories in the actual novels, what people call the Gospels, I just call them the Jesus novels. There are 4 Jesus novels. If you start using their language, you forget that they're just talking about stories written by people. And they're just stories written by people. I don't care all people agree on that. I mean, all religious people agree. Yes, they're stories written by people. Okay.
Well, let's for a second, for anybody that might not be very educated on this stuff, can we get into maybe how these three different novels, I guess, right, sort of stemmed from the same thing? I mean, am I right there?
Yeah, there are 4 Jesus novels that got put into the thing called the Bible, and the Bible was really a collection put together in the 300s by a guy called Eusebius and under an emperor called Constantine. And they were just trying to bring together all the different cults that worshipped a Jewish Messiah.
And we're talking about the Council of Nicaea, correct?
Yeah, there was the Nicene Council, and there were many other councils that strung along through the early Middle Ages, or the late Roman Empire, that really, they had to decide a lot of stuff, like whether Jesus was born a god or whether he was made into a god. That was something they had to decide. There were 70, 100, I don't know, nobody knows how many different novels or gospels, novellas, of this Jesus character. The first one was written, as far as anybody can tell, by a guy named Marcion. And Marcion was an actual historical figure. He was a shipping magnate who lived near somewhere in Turkey. And the Marcionite Christians had they wrote the first, novel, gospel, or he and his people did, and he put it out, and it was a collected story. It might have eventually served as the genesis for the thing called Luke, because there are some similarities there. And his was a very pagan Jesus. He rejected Judaism. He rejected the Jewish God, Yahweh. He said that the God that Jesus was a very different God. He said that Jesus never really quite had a body, but Jesus was manifested here, but he could never really be killed. It's just superhero stuff. It's just bizarre superhero stuff. And it comes out of the Judaic belief system that they were going to have a savior who would make sure that they were still Yahweh's chosen people. So you have to go back to ask the question of who were the Jews. Again, the problem in the Western mind about talking about God and this and that and the other thing is people in an Eastern tradition would say that everything is God, that all of the notions that you have are inspired by one deity or another, all deities being a manifestation of the infinite unknowable. Therefore, polytheists are frankly more monotheistic than monotheists, who believe that there's a God who has a son and there's a ghost running around and there's a magical virgin and then there are the angels and all this other crap, and they still say that there's only one God. This is clear polytheism, just by a different name. Christianity is as polytheistic as any polytheistic religion. They just don't seem to understand the value of it. Polytheistic religions like Hinduism or ancient Greek, Hinduism especially, and some of the African and Asian religions understand that there's an infinite energy source from which all things migrate or transpire or whatever, precipitate, and that they look different at times, so we grant them the difference. All Native American religions understand that there's a great spirit, and then everything else is an incarnation or a manifestation of the spirit in different ways. So those are those are different gods. Catholics have all kinds of gods. They create saints and they grant them magical powers after their death. Everybody's polytheistic. I've never met anybody who wasn't. Everybody who goes to a Disney movie and makes a character like, a doorknob or like a little teddy bear into like a living creature is a polytheist. That's what polytheism is. You're putting a soul into something that you would not otherwise grant a soul. You're seeing the soul in all things. All right, well, you got to go back to the ancient Hebrew. So there's no problem in a polytheistic culture to say that you're talking to God in your head, because there's so many gods, you can talk to any of them, and they can have different points of view, so you're always fine. In Christianity, you believe you're talking to the one crucified Son, who is the God, by the way. He's not really the Son, he's also the God, which doesn't make any sense. Who was imbued with the Holy Spirit, which is somehow different but the same, which doesn't make any sense. But you got to go back to the Hebrews. Mm-hmm. And the Hebrews lived in Palestine, right just north of Egypt, and they had a real history. And the history involved at least two tribes, the northern, the Israelite, and the southern, the Judean tribe. the tribe of Judah lived in a harder, more mountainous area. The tribe of Israel lived in a slightly more fertile area and had a little better luck. There was never an imprisonment in Egypt. No archaeologist, no good historian. There are some biblical historians that will tell you all kinds of things, but there are no actual historians who look at data and material and the cuneiform or the hieroglyphic records of Egypt, and there are scads and volumes and mountains of hieroglyphic records from Egypt. There was no exodus of 600,000 male slaves, equaling some quarter of the Egyptian population at the time, plus all of their wives, plus all of their children, that just left Egypt in the 1400s, 1500s BC, and walked through the desert for 40 years and then repopulated Palestine. That didn't happen. There are no records of it. There's no record of people going missing. There's no record of great crop failures because all the slaves left. Didn't happen. There's no historical Moses. This is an amalgam figure, probably of a variety, but Moses is influenced in the creation by Sargon, by the Babylonian and Assyrian figures, and there's a reason for that. The northern Jews were taken essentially. They kept being overrun by different people. First, the Assyrian Empire, coming from the areas that we call Iran and Iraq, then the Babylonian Empire, coming from what we now call Iraq, took over the whole area, which borders the Mediterranean. And the intelligentsia, the scribes and the writers and the scribes and the priests were all taken into servitude in Babylon. So they were moved to the biggest city of the time. And they got to see a big functioning city that had a law code. The law code was the Code of Hammurabi, which was written on a giant, stone tablet. Remind you of anything? That had, hundreds and hundreds of prescriptions about what you should do, including eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, what a woman should do, what a man should do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they spent 60 years or so under this rule. They drunk the myths of Gilgamesh, the myth of Gilgamesh, a man looking for eternal life, who meets the man called Utnapishtim, who built an ark because the gods destroyed the earth for being so wicked, and took all the animals with him, and then landed, and so he was an immortal person, favored by the gods for that. They absorbed the lesson of, I think, Sargon being abandoned in a basket as a baby, going down and being discovered by somebody and raised as a prince. Well, does that sound like anything? So all of these myths of Moses, and there was a Job story, there was a Tower of Babel story, there was a fall from grace from the animal nature, the perfect animal nature, in the story of Enkidu in Gilgamesh. There was a perfect garden where people used to live and no longer did. I think there was even a snake. All of these stories are there, and some of them are inverted, like the snake might have been good instead of bad, et cetera, et cetera. The Hebrews inside of Babylon would have wanted to protect their culture, so they would have rejected certain Babylonian ideas while absorbing them at the same time. So if the snake was good, they might have made it bad. But they still would have borrowed all these ideas, and they did. And they came back, and there in Babylon, they wrote most of what we call the Bible, most of the Pentateuch, most of those 5 stories. When we think of the Bible, we think of Genesis, Cain and Abel, we think of the flood, and we think of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. Well, there were many people in Palestine who went and inhabited part of Egypt when the crops would be bad. So there were Semitic speaking people who might have been Hebraic. There were certainly Semitic people from Palestine who overtook a part of Egypt for a period of time and became a ruling dynasty. I think they were the 14th or 15th dynasty of Egypt. Oh, wow. They were called the Hyksos. They may not have been entirely Jewish, but they were Semitic, and they would have the Egyptians eventually drove them back into Palestine. So there's a record of being expelled from Egypt, but not as slaves, as rulers. Then people were taken as slaves in Babylon, and they wrote a story, and they integrated all of this, the way that people write myths, the way that J.J. Abrams, and people get together and write Star Wars or Star Trek or Lost, or based on stuff that has happened to people, based on mysteries that have already been written about. It's just what writers do. They take some remembered experience and they mix it with some mythic elements and they make somebody a Superman. Hammurabi's code was supposedly given to him by the sun god. Well, Moses' code was supposedly given to him by the sky god. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. There's a reason why, many scholars will tell you that Judaism is a replay of all the other religions that came around it, the same way that the United States government is a replay of the Roman civilization and the European parliaments. It's the same, and then it takes place in a new environment, so it looks like it's a little bit different. Well, the Hebrews had this story that they were chosen, but they were never really loyal enough to Yahweh. They kept worshiping all the other people's gods. I forget to say that the Hebrews had all kinds of gods. One notable god the southern Hebrews had was called Asherah, who's related to, sort of a model of Ishtar. Mm-hmm. But they eventually killed her. And Asherah would have been Yahweh's girlfriend or wife, consort. When they killed her, they were left with just one angry male god. Well, now you're really screwed because there's no model for sex anymore. So the Hebrews, more than any group of people on earth, began to condemn female sexuality. Uh-huh. There was no model for female sexuality anymore. There was no temple of the goddess. The Babylonians had Ishtar, but the Hebrews had killed their Ishtar, Asherah. So there was no more female to sacrifice to or worship or think of in a good way sexually.
Well, let me ask you this real quick.
That's
on
the
that
culture
note.
we inherited.
Are we seeing the remnants of that when we see there's undoubtedly terrible treatment of women in the Middle East? Is that sort of is that the remnants of what you're talking about?
Well, the Muslims who had a polytheistic society before Muhammad, who was either real or an amalgam figure, but certainly the Muhammad that we think about isn't real. I mean, the problem with talking about historical figures who've been made into legends is that we're not talking about a real person anymore. We don't know. I mean, there's too much time. So even if people think that there was an historical Jesus, by the way, there's no record of an historical Jesus anywhere written by any historian during his whole lifetime and for 100 years after. So it comes about as myth. Even if there was...
That's not true, Liam. I saw the Shroud of Turin.
Right. Right.
I'm sorry,
go ahead. Do you know how many shrouds, how many death shrouds, how many hundreds of death shrouds there were? How many tons of the true cross ended up being manufactured in Europe, like a Disneyland, a Disneyland for Jesophiles? This is what the Middle Ages were about. You could go see the true cross and the true birthplace and the true death place, and they eventually made them into sort of Disneyland events, Disneyland attractions. They weren't based on an historical location. They were based on, pretty good. This is where maybe it should have been. Uh-huh. But yes, the Middle East went from being polytheistic to following the Abrahamic, so-called tradition, another non-historical figure, and deciding that they had to winnow it down to one angry male god who demanded absolute slavish loyalty. In that context, there is no model for female sexuality. And in that context, women are either whores or wives. And wives cannot be sexual except to produce children, and whores cannot be wives, and so they cannot be respected. You can have both, but a woman cannot be a wife and be very sexual. And we see this problem over and over again in Western culture. If you're a sexual woman, you're a whore or a slut. If you're a good wife, you are not very sexual. Now, some Christians will say, no, God encourages it. The problem with the Bible is that it says so many things. You could decide to only read Song of Songs or Song of Solomon and think it was the grooviest thing on earth. But then you forgot about Leviticus. And Leviticus is actually the central axis of the Bible. It occurs 3 times. The Ten Commandments, and then Leviticus, and then all the rules that follow in Judges and the rest of that kind of stuff. And then Jesus comes back in the story to say, you guys failed to uphold the law, so God is having at it one more time, and now I am the law, and all you have to do to do the law is to believe in me. And then in some of the different novels, some of the novelists, like Mark as a novelist, he wasn't really a guy, but, a group or an idea. The Mark story is really, more fair to the Jews, and then the Matthew story is very pro-Jewish. The Luke story is pretty anti-Jewish, and the John story is absolutely anti-Jewish. So they were trying, by the end, to get away from the Jewish Messiah idea. But the Jesus idea originally, for the people who invented it, was that that Yahweh was going to forgive them for not following the law, Leviticus, and do a blood sacrifice, not of an animal, but of a human. Because, they always needed these blood sacrifices. And so there would be one person. When people say, Jesus died for my sins, they don't really mean that. We didn't, you don't have to have any sins for Jesus. They mean that the Jews didn't follow the law well enough. And so Jesus was a permanent sacrifice, so people didn't have to follow the law very well. That's exactly what it means.
Which is a weird thought.
Which is a really bloody weird thought. But that's what Christians mean. Whether they understand it or not, they mean that the Jews failed to follow Leviticus, the 600 and something prescriptions. Don't cut your beard. Don't cut your hair if you're a woman. Don't lie with any woman who is having menses. Don't ever lie with a man. If you do this on Tuesday, take an ox and kill it and take its fat and rub it on a brass thing and walk around 3 times on a left-hand circle. And if you don't do that, we'll kill you. So that's Leviticus, and it's the most obsessive, compulsive document that anybody could ever write or read.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but let's get into a few more of the funny aspects of that. It also says no tattoos, correct? There's just a ton of ridiculous things.
Don't tattoo yourself, don't mark your skin. There are a lot of things you can't do. Cutting your beard is one of them, of course, or squaring it, and cutting your hair. If you're a woman, you can never cut your hair, ever. Mm. So, the fundamentalists in America grab Leviticus and they form these cults, these sort of Amish-looking cults, and the women are not allowed to cut their hair. And our friend Joni Abbott actually was in one of these, and she escaped, and she'll tell you all about it. They actually quote Leviticus, and you know what? I want to grant the fundamentalists something. They're right. That's what the Bible's about, which is... the Bible is about Leviticus. Jesus said in one of the pro-Jewish scriptures, I think it was Matthew, if you think I'm here to throw away the law, you're wrong. I'm here to uphold the law, you MRFers. So what the guys who wrote Matthew were saying was, no, we're sticking up for the old Jewish law, so you still have to do everything. You can't get divorced just because you want to. You cannot get divorced no matter what. That's a covenant with your God Yahweh, so you can't get divorced. I don't care if your husband's kicking you when you're pregnant. Who cares? You can't get divorced. So all of the things, slavery is fine as long as they're not in your tribe. Jesus was not Jesus the guy, but the people who wrote him were very clear about that. They didn't want to get rid of the things that worked for them.
Yeah.
Now, the final Jesus story that got included is so different. Instead of the thing taking a year, it takes 3 years. He's always magical. He's the Alpha and Omega. He's not different at all from Yahweh, and he's transcendent. When he dies, he doesn't say, he doesn't say, what the hell have you done to, where have you been? What have you done for me lately? Or where have you been? And he doesn't say, God, forgive them. He just says it is done. Like, I'm ready to go now. I'm in control. He surrenders himself. He's just there to fulfill it's so unrealistic. He's there to fulfill a prophecy so that the new Christian movement that had already emerged by the time this thing was written in the probably 120 or so, this reformulation of the story, changing all of the details, except that he was the son of Yahweh, but not really anymore. He is Yahweh as the son of Yahweh. Strange. He is the Holy Ghost as the son of Yahweh. And then when he dies, he doesn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me? He says, ready to go. Click. And then he dies. He doesn't die until click, he wants to die. David Fitzgerald points this out in his book, and I'm paraphrasing him. His book is called Nailed, and you can get it on Amazon. And I'll include some of this in mine. But the stories are they're clearly written by different political factions. All you have to do is read and go, wow, that's really frickin' different. Hey, that's really different. Well, the first guy was Mark, but they didn't like the story because he wasn't very magical. It was just, not very interesting. The second one was Matthew, and that was really punched up, and the power of the miracles or the magic tricks was increased, and they didn't take as long to accomplish, and they weren't as weird. Like, he didn't just kill a fig tree because the fig tree wouldn't produce fruit. And Mark is like, screw you, fig tree. You are dead to me. That was my interview with Trevor Eugene of Vibin Higher. We will be right back with the rest of the Liam Scheff Show here on UCY TV and Truth Frequency Radio. Hi, welcome back to the Liam Scheff Show on UCY TV and Truth Frequency Radio. Listener mailbag segment. I want to thank Trevor Eugene of Vibin Higher for that excellent show, that wonderful segment. The full interview is there at vibinhigher.com, vibinhigher.com. It's on YouTube. And you can find the unexpurgated 90 minutes rather than the expurgated 30, and enjoy our talks about oil, Fukushima, cultural decline, oil decline, the fake sciences, and more. Let's read a couple letters from listener mailbag. I post things on the FBI social network from time to time for my own edification and enjoyment. They call them memes, which is a terrible word that Richard Dawkins made up, or maybe he stole it from somebody. But anyway, the idea was that there's something called a gene, and he said there was something called a meme, which is an idea that spreads virally. Of course, he should have called it a bacteria or something like that. So there's so many problems with that statement, but of course the name is stuck. And now we call these little pictures that go around on Facebook memes, and I make them. I make many of them because it's easy, it's amusing, and it helps me process the research that I'm doing. That's why. So, I was asking this question: why would people believe in things that aren't true? And I found a picture of the character called Ishu, who we amusingly call Jesus, and he's walking on water with his hands up in the Yoga Om position, looking to receive all the sunlight. After all, he was a sun god, a sun deity, a solar deity. And I took a painting of Superman, and I juxtaposed them, laid them on top of each other. And I wrote, but why would people believe in things that aren't true? And at the bottom, I just wrote the words, because we're a storytelling monkey and we can't help ourselves. Well, that's meant to make people ponder. Oh my God, there's Superman. We know that's not true. And there's Jesus. People liked it. It got however many 100 views or hits or clicks or whatever. And I put it on one page. I put it on Frankie Val's page, which is a contentious little page full of some interesting people and a lot of termites who just want to chew on things. And somebody wrote, "You are completely worthless." There was no explanation, like, were they defending Superman or Jesus? Don't associate Jesus and Superman. Superman's a wonderful person. Didn't even say. So I had to say goodbye to that person, because I try not to deal with psychopaths. But there it was. Mailbag number 1. You are completely worthless for pointing out that Superman and Jesus are both characters who appear in books and are fictional. Whether you believe that, by the way, that Jesus or Ishu was an historical person, the Jesus that comes down to you from the books is fictional. And you can tell that by looking at the things that he's supposed to have said. From story to story, those things are radically different. Those things are radically different. In some, they're very pro-Jewish, and some, they're very anti-Jewish. You would expect somebody who was living for a very short time and recorded by eyewitnesses and considered a worthwhile source to quote, and not just some sort of Charles Manson figure, to be relatively consistent in his message. But no, that's not the case with the Ishu or Yeshua or Isu or Jesus figure. It's not consistent at all. In fact, most of what's said is what we now call a callback to the previous comics. So you have the previous Jesus stories, or the previous hero stories, the magical magician stories, Elisha and Elijah, and then you have the Isaiah Chronicles, in which you get a line about a young woman giving birth to a king called Emmanuel. I believe that's what it is. And then later, of course, they needed to say that was the prophecy, and so they mistranslated young woman into virgin. It's famous. I mean, it's well understood by all biblical scholars worth anything that young woman was converted from the Greek, Aramaic into the Roman, and it was misunderstood, or was it the Hebrew into the Latin, and it was misunderstood and mistranslated as virgin, when really the word just meant young woman, or maid, a young maid. But the word virgin was then put into, I guess, what they call the Latin version of, the Hebrew thing. And then when they went to write the new Jesus novels, they call them Gospels, but that's just to confuse you. They're just novellas, or graphic novels, or plays. When they went to go write the new Jesus novels, they put in, this satisfies that line about the virgin. Well, there was no line about a virgin. Well, it was a mistranslation. Never mind, we're stuck with it. And from that point on, all women had to pretend that if they were good, they had no sex. Well, the Hebrews sort of helped that along anyway, because in their two tribes, they ended up killing the goddess in the southern tribe, I believe. The southern tribe, I believe, called Judah. They killed Asherah, who was the consort of Yahweh, the war god. The same way that the Hindus all have consorts, male and female, for each other. Shiva has a consort, and Krishna has one or several. I suppose Vishnu might, but really Krishna is the incarnation of Vishnu on earth. Sound familiar? Anybody? Because if you remember, Jesus really isn't the son of God. Jesus is God. I mean, that's the game that Christianity plays, that it's not polytheism. Real polytheism just states that you name all of the forces in the universe and you grant them a personality. That's polytheism. That's how we work. I mean, that's how atheists are funny, because they take that joy away from themselves and then they give science a personality of perfection. Science is perfect. But we'll get to that in our second thing for the mailbag. Let's just finish this short thought on the Jesus novels. The Jesus novels have a different character for every occasion. There's no logic in the processional of events. Magic done in one moment can be forgotten in the next, so that it can be done in the next moment. If there are a couple stories floating around about magicians making food, because food is a hard commodity to find in the ancient world, and we'll find ourselves there again. So it's a great superhero power to be able to make food. It's a great power. Like, shooting webs out of your wrists instead of your, I guess, anus, or a gland near your butthole, which is how Spider-Man really should get around if he did become a spider. He should have a gland beneath his coccyx. No, coccyx, look it up, with an X. And just shoot webs backwards from his behind. If he's really going to be a spider, anyway, Spider-Man should look more like a spider. But it's a great superpower to have for a New Yorker in the 60s and 70s, to be able to shoot webs out of his wrists and swing across town in 4 minutes. We invent the superpowers that we need. The superpowers come out of necessity. So it's a great superpower in the ancient world to be able to make food, because food is hard to come by. So, it's a great superpower to be able to skip along on water, because a lot of people drown. It's a great superpower to be able to cure diseases that nobody has cures for, like leprosy. Great superpower. Blindness. Things you cannot cure in the ancient world, and even in the modern world very well. It's great superpower. So that's why I made that little meme, because Jesus was Superman, the same way that Samson was Superman, the same way, it was a violent, murderous one. Same way Conan the Barbarian was Superman, for a different cultural mindset, for, an Attila the Hun, a Genghis Khan mindset. That's really what Conan was about. So the Jesus novels trade in a variety of characters who come and go as they please within a couple of paragraphs. If you think I'm come here to bring peace, no, I'm here to bring a sword. Love one another. If somebody beats you up, let them beat you up the rest of the way. If they hit one cheek, offer them the other to assault you with. If somebody takes a little of your stuff, give them the rest of your stuff. Give them every other piece of possession that you have. If somebody wants to borrow something from you, give them everything, because poverty is good. For whom? For a government that wants people to be mental slaves and feel that they have no ownership in the work that they do, I guess. The character of Jesus is asking that you be enslaved. But somebody doesn't like the fact that I posted something about Superman and Jesus, and they said that you're worthless. Well, that's great Christian sentiment. Come on. Honestly. I have a great value to the people that I love, but apparently that person's not one of them. In fact, we all do. And supposedly Christian sentiment is that we all have value, but it's not if you point out to Christians Christians that Christian sentiment isn't to be found in Christianity. Christian sentiment, by the way, is to be found by people who grow up in Christianity and want to make Christianity nicer. So you got to work to find the niceness in Christianity, because what you're left with, if you're just being honest, is the Bible. And that is one ugly book of, the great book of Hebrew fairy tales about rape, genocide, incest, and murder. It's not a nice book. It's not a nice book. And you can go read it. You can go read it if you can get through all the ands. It's written as one long sentence of verbal diarrhea so that you don't know where you are and you don't know what's happening. But if you remove the unnecessary ands and thous and put them to yous, and you take a good version that tells the truth, instead of calling Asherah, the goddess, the grove, translating into a grove of trees, and calls her Asherah, you're like, well, they're talking about a goddess here. Yahweh's consort. Well, they must have been polytheists. And then they winnowed down to monotheism. I don't know. As the kids say, they got butthurt about it. They destroyed the love of the female, the love of femininity, and therefore the love of sex. They actually destroyed the love of sex by giving the god no one to play with. The Greeks did not destroy the love of sex. They had the gods play very much with humans and each other. The Roman gods were very, very horny. Read a little Ovid. Read Ovid's Metamorphoses. Oh, I mean, he was so scandalous that he was put on an island toward the end of his life to winnow away the remaining years, because he has so offended the sensibilities of some of the prudish types. There were a few prudish, Augustus especially, Octavianus, got to be very prudish, which is disappointing. But he did. He even banished his daughter to an island because she was having too good a time, too licentious. Lurid, licentious, and vile, as Tom Lehrer would say. Let's go to the mailbag. Here, I posted a weblog, last June, called "Astronomers Slowly Begin to Realize Official Stories is Better Than NASA's Thinking." Well, I'll just read this to you. If you read my book, Official Stories, you learn in Chapter 9 that we are on an electromagnetic planet in an electromagnetic sea of charged particles, a plasma, which forms in distinct patterns, chords or currents, tubes, and layers. No, there was no Big Bang. That's a myth invented by a priest, Georges Lemaitre, in the 1920s. We live in a plasma-filled and fueled electrical universe. The book, Official Stories, Counter-Arguments for a Culture in Need, the mainstream can't quite let itself catch up. Here's them trying to make sense of reality while holding on to the broken Big Bang model. Here's a link from a Science Daily. We saw a striking pattern in the sky where stripes of high-density plasma neatly alternated with stripes of low-density plasma. Remember, neatly alternated. Was I just not talking about the neat patterns of plasma? This pattern drifted slowly and aligned beautifully with the Earth's magnetic field lines like the aurora. Magnetic field lines and electromagnetism are the same thing. But, Big Bang, Mrs. Loy said, and there's the link there on the page. Again, astronomers slowly begin to realize official stories is better than NASA's thinking. So you can read that Science Daily report. But what they're saying is the universe is plasma and it's electromagnetic. They say, they realize they may be on to something big. Yeah, I wrote, it's called plasma physics. It's been around for 100 years. Official Stories strikes again. Liam Scheff is the author of Official Stories, So I got a response, and this is why people who hate scientists and hate the sciences in general, I'm not talking about flush toilets, by the way. I'm talking about the narcissistic, arrogant, pin-headed, dick-headed, laboratory PhD candidate for 100 years, succubi, inhabiting and infesting universities, stealing your money to do more research on how to starve plants to death to convince themselves that genetically modifying them is good for them. Okay, fuck all of them. Comment by Vivi. Ugh, plasma is not a substance. It's not? It's a state of matter. Oh. It's not a substance, it's a state of matter. Is matter a substance? Okay, go fuck yourself. The state the sun happens to be in. but is not found naturally on Earth. Actually, it's found naturally on Earth. It's found all the time. It's called lightning, you stupid bitch. Water cannot be plasma because it is liquid. I learned that in my 8th grade science, physical science, and I was one of the worst school districts in the country. Try again. All right. Thank you for your comment, you stupid, stupid whore. Let's go back to the original article. I'm scanning it. No, I didn't talk about water at all. So you get to be wrong. But thanks for entering your thing into the mailbag. Stupid, 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 stupid idiot. I'm not going to post that comment because I don't have anything nice to say about it, but I did read it here on the show. It's too painfully stupid. And, of course, I don't know who she is. It's a fake name. It's nobody claiming any academic credentials. And you see that it's ad hominem from the beginning. Ugh! That's why I called her a stupid, stupid, stupid whore. Because I don't care. If somebody comes at me with ad hominems, I'm just going to return with ad hominems. They're not worth talking to. If you start that way, then fuck you. If you start by saying, you're not a scientist, then fuck you. Fuck you. If you come in and you say, look, you're right. There's plasma in space. You're right. The sciences are easily corruptible. But I'm not convinced that the Big Bang doesn't have some validity. I will have the most wonderful conversation with you that we both could possibly have. And I will be so impressed by your charm and your ability to maintain a conversation with somebody who you don't entirely agree with. But if you start the conversation, because, as the kids say, your butt hurt. Well, fuck you. Mailbag number... I had one more. I did. I lost it. I had another great entry into the mailbag. Oh, I really did. Okay, I'll continue with this plasma physics thing for another minute. There's a great article by... and by the way, why should you be polite from people who are stealing from you? I mean, I'm not listening to the fake words of the fake Jesus novels. If somebody punches you in the face, punch them in the fucking face or get the fuck away from them. There you go. There's good advice. If somebody punches you in the face, get the fuck away from them and make sure that everybody knows they're a psychopath. There you are. There you go. That's good advice. Why didn't you say that in the Sermon on the Mount? Hey, if somebody punches you in the face, tell them to fuck themselves. Get away from them. Tell them they're a psychopath. And get everybody else to understand that they're a psychopath so nobody else has to get punched in the face. There you are. If somebody steals from you, point out to everybody that they've stolen from you. Hey, this person stole from me and I don't fucking appreciate it. I do not appreciate it. There you go. How about that for advice? Can you please not steal? Can you return what you stole? Well, science steals from us all the time. And we let it. By the way, we let it. So if you want to get up on your high horse, you have to get on your high horse about your own self because you let it. We let it. We all do. We're pre-programmed to allow a group of kings and a group of priests to tell us what's true. We like the pleasure to complain about them. We like the pleasure to whisper about them in our little cloisters and say, I don't know if I would do it that way. I'm not really sure, I pay my taxes and all that, but, I'm not sure, what I mean. So we like to complain. We like to go about our business and complain. We like to bitch and complain. The church is just so disgraceful, but, I just think they get Jesus all wrong. Jesus was about love. And I think that Jesus would have been in favor of gay marriage. No, Jesus wouldn't have been in favor of gay marriage. You know why? Because, number one, it's not an historical figure. It's a character in 4 novels that we're stuck with. 4 terrible novels that don't make any sense in the great Hebrew book of... Hold on a second. Hold on, I got it. The big book of Hebrew myths, crazy rules, anti-woman homophobia, incest, genocide, and wizardry. It's called the Holy Bible, with Apocrypha. Jesus wouldn't have been in favor of it, by the way, if he had been a Messianic Jew, because Messianic Hebrews at that point were all about Leviticus, and Leviticus was not about honoring your right to marry your gay partner. So why do you give a fuck what the Bible says? It's a hateful, 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 hateful book. It is hateful. It is about the worst episodes of genocidal violence. There are a couple nice bits. Song of Solomon is nice. It's not the nice... Rumi is better. It's not the nicest love poetry, but it ain't bad. The story of Job has some power to it because it says that life will roll over you. and you have to just understand that it will not make sense and you will cry bitter tears. There is that aspect to things. That's not bad as a myth goes. That myth comes from Babylon. It's taken from another myth about God's punishing a man. The Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, love poetry, sex poetry has been around forever. There's always love poetry and sex poetry. The idea that the Bible is great because it contains a list of rules for a culture is not true. Hammurabi's Code was the source of the Bible's rules of a culture, so you can go back. The Egyptians were better record keepers, and they have a longer history of record keeping than the Hebrews were, and they were more honest. They weren't mythologizing everything. They did worship their king as the son of the sun god, or as the sun god on earth. So they weren't exactly logical. But beyond that, they kept good records of agriculture, of wars, things like that. We're stuck with this book because people got stuck with it, and it was the only thing that was available to read. It had great press agents for a long time. People fought wars about, my God is better than your God. We had to go to the Middle East to fight for the scraps. The several hundred tons of the Holy Cross that were manufactured, however many it was. The many, 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 many thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of the one true cross that were manufactured like Mickey Mouse ears for, medieval Europe to venerate the idea that this thing was true. It was Harry Potter at Universal Studios, all through Europe in the Middle Ages. The whole Jesus movement created Jesus Funland all through on the road to Acre and through Palestine, through down to Jerusalem. They created all of these fun spots to stop. They created a Nazareth where there was just about nothing. I mean, they created the holy town that didn't exist. It was a mistranslation of the word Nazarene. Nazarene being a sect of Hebrews who practiced Gnosticism. Jesus Funland was in full tilt in the Middle Ages, and in many ways still is. What do you think the Vatican is about? It's Jesus Funland. Pedophiles, psychopaths, thieves, for generations. The popes, the peeps. Priests wouldn't have been that bad a thing. People who said, be patient and love the greater spirit of the universe. But something really weird happened in about 1000, or was it 1100 or so. The Pope, and the name really escapes me right now, but the Pope at that point decided that priests could no longer have children. Because up to that point, priests could bone. Priests could get it on. They could have wives, maybe a couple. They were just dudes who believed that there was a guy named Jesus who walked on water and made a lot of food, because that's the superhero powers that they worshipped at that point. Well, they could still, enjoy some, but pussy. They could still have a good time. They could have the sex that they wanted to have. Monasteries, this sort of thing, were very just often fronts for various kinds of slavery, including prostitution and brothels and this sort of thing. So priests and, the priest class and the class of prostitutes often went hand in hand. And I can get a citation for that. Maybe I'll do a show about that, so I can actually dig that up and you can enjoy the salaciousness of that comment. But they were forbidden by the Pope of about 1100, 1200 from having children. Oh, they were forbidden from having their children inherit the church's lands. Aha. And then they were forbidden from marrying. And then anybody who was married was forced to relinquish it, whatever it would be called, recant it. And then priests could no longer have children and no longer be married, and then they had to be celibate. Well, why? Because property passes through the father, and the priests were all men, and their property was church property. Ding, 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 ding. The celibate priesthood came about because the church didn't want to be divided up. They wanted to hold on to their assets for those 2,000 years, or 1,000 years, sorry. They wanted to hold on to their assets for the last 1,000 years. They didn't want to parcel them up all around Europe and America. Otherwise, being a Christian priest or a priest in the Christian class wouldn't really be that big a deal. You'd say, yeah, I'm married and I have a great time and I go out and, I believe that there was this magic guy who walked around and walked on water and made a lot of food. And these are my kids. And yeah, some of them believe it, some of them don't. And this is my wife. Bone her constantly. Totally hot for her after all these years. Look at that girl. We swing sometimes, yeah. Oh, no, I'm the priest of the parish. But no, you couldn't do it. So there's my response to the person who said that, you use the word worthless. I want you to go back and read your church history and realize that Christianity is just so nonsensical. I'm very annoyed with the health freedom people who stand up and invoke Jesus at every turn, because they're frauds. I mean, they may be standing up for something good, but they're not doing due diligence as it relates to the biggest official story in the history of the Western world, which is that there was a magical guy who inherited all of the law of the ancient Hebrews, who had a magical war deity after they buried the female. I'm not into it. I think most people truly aren't into it. That's why so many good Christians, good people who happen to be Christians, struggle so much with Christianity. Because it's impossible. It's impossible to maintain with a straight head or a straight face or a level head. And you have to make all of these exceptions. And you have to say Jesus preached love when you know damn well there's no love being preached in the Bible. There's one line, love each other. In between all the other things about how there's only one good tree and then one bad, there's either a good tree or a bad tree. You got to get rid of all the bad trees. You're either with us, you're either with me, or you're against me. I am not here to bring people together. I'm here to separate turn the father against the son, the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law. I'm here to turn brother against brother to the point of death. There's your Jesus. Why? Because it's a character written for political reasons in probably about 70 to 100 AD, what we now call 70 to 100 AD. These stories were emerging after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You're listening to the Liam Scheff Show on Truth Frequency Radio and UCY TV. Thank you very much for supporting this program. Go to my webpage and put $5 to $20 into PayPal. Thank you very much for that. Please go buy my book, Official Stories, working on the sequel right now on Amazon.com. We'll see you next week. Stay tuned, UCY, for the Run Out Groove. Thank you very much for listening to the show. I don't usually like to mess with Mr. In-Between. I don't usually like to read the hate mail because it's brought out the worst in other people. It brings out the worst in me. My quick response to is, fuck you. Go away. You're not interested in a conversation, so fuck off. Go somewhere that you're having a better time. I'm not interested. But I read some of it today because that's sort of the tenor of what comes in. It's never really more interesting than that. The people who tend to be more polite make circular arguments, and they tend to ignore what I'm presenting to them. And they say, well, maybe, but this many Elvis fans couldn't be wrong. I was one of the people growing up. There was an album of Elvis Greatest Hits. I think it was called 30 Million Elvis Fans Can't Be Wrong. And my answer was always the same. It was, yeah, they can. Elvis is not that great. Sorry. It's not that interesting. There are better musicians out there. So, yes, 30 million Elvis fans can be wrong. And I guess I've held to that line. And it's fine if you like Elvis. I'm not trying to knock Elvis for you. But I'm saying you don't have to agree with anything because 30 million people think it's right. You have to agree with it because you've applied basic logic. Basic logic, which means you measure something from all angles. So why doesn't Big Bang Theory work? Because it's not a theory. You can't test it at all. You can't measure it at all. And the two things they propose to measure it, microwave background radiation and redshift, which I've talked about and I'll talk about again, don't work. I mean, they go away. You just realize they've come up with any number of figures for background microwave radiation, and that redshift changes over time, and clusters of stellar objects have different redshift when they should all be the same if they're really at the same place. The Jesus stuff can't be tested. It really is a book of great Hebrew myths. I don't know why we don't understand that. I don't know why we don't understand that. I really don't. It's not that hard to fathom. Every culture has myths. We don't go and say, "Hey, did you worship Hercules today?" Well, what do you mean? He comes from the ancient Greek scrolls. We really should worship him. I mean, did you worship Zeus today? Did you make a sacrifice? What? What do you mean you don't believe in Zeus? What? My God, what are you? Are you some kind of heathen? Oh, I don't know what to say. I can't talk to you. You must have no moral value at all. We don't do that. Why don't you